turn in your Bibles to Mark chapter 8 as we continue in our verse-by-verse study. I think if we reflect over this past week, you're probably happy that it's a new week, starting on Sunday. Last week was a doozy. We saw a country fall, and with that happening, we see, go figure, Republicans and Democrats finger pointing over whose fault it is, like that never happens. But you know, our prayer is definitely for the men and women that are trapped in Afghanistan. People searching for a way out, a way to the airport. We're sitting at a time where, you know, for a while ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, they weren't really much in Americans' forefront of thought. And all of a sudden, once again, you know, many fear what might happen. Many people look at this and they say it's like the fall of Saigon all over again. You know, a couple months back, we were very happy that COVID cases had dropped to their lowest levels. We were so happy to drop the masks, only to see now again this last week, cases skyrocket. Little children now are getting the infection. I do a lot of driving and I listen to the radio quite a bit, and I was listening to an interview with a lady from Children's Hospital. And she was talking how bad it is, and it's not just the children that are getting COVID, but Children's Hospital is overrun because alongside with COVID, we have flu and colds and pneumonia amongst children. That's not COVID related, but just that children are being around themselves, and these are things that go on. So now they're battling what typically would be flus plus the new COVID cases. Many places are reinstating mask mandates. There's fear of lockdowns in many areas. And then if you've checked the prices or gone to the grocery store, you've noticed inevitably that inflation is on the rise. The average cost now to own a new car is like $10,000 to $12,000 a month on average for maintenance, insurance, taxes, and the purchase price of the car, up about $2,000 from just a year ago. We are in fear, many are in fear of hyperinflation overcoming our country. And it's very likely that, like the old country song, there will be too much month at the end of the money. So open your Bibles to Mark chapter 8. To what?
Don't forget the earthquakes.
Oh yeah, the earthquakes in Haiti. Many, many things. In those days, when a great crowd had gathered and they had nothing to eat, he called his disciples to him and said to them, I have compassion on the crowd, because they have been with me now 3 days and have had nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way. And some of them have come from far away. And his disciples answered him, how can one feed these people with bread here in this desolate place? And he asked them, how many loaves do you have? They said 7. And he directed the crowd to sit down on the ground. And he took the 7 loaves, and having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And they set them down before the crowd. And they had a few small fish. And having blessed them, he said that these also should be set before them. And they ate and were satisfied. And they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. And there were about 4,000 people. And he set them away. And immediately he got into the boat with the disciples, and they went to the district of Dalmanutha. It was just 2 chapters back that we read that Jesus fed 6,000, or 5,000 in chapter 6. 2 chapters back in chapter 6, Jesus had just fed 5,000 people in a very similar manner. And now there's only 4,000 people. And we might ask ourselves, reading this, and be like, how possibly could the disciples ask him, how are we going to feed these people? It hadn't been too long ago he had done the same exact miracle for more people than what were here. Did they forget? Did their remembrance fail? I mean, I don't know exactly how long this would have been, but we could guess that it was probably not more than a month ago. You know, as we've been studying in Mark, we focused on healing. In that there is an undeniable connection between faith and healing. This is not a formula. God does not operate in formulas in our lives. It's not faith equals healing. If you have faith, you will be healed. No, that's not the way Scripture reveals it. But there is an undeniable connection, a link between faith and healing. And as we've studied, we've seen both the faith of the individuals and the faith of those around an individual have been instrumental in their healing. And this has led us on, as we've been studying precept by precept, to examine faith a little bit. And as we've examined faith and studied faith, because there's a connection between faith and healing, we need to understand what faith is. We ask the question, what is the opposite of faith? And those that have been here, you know there is no opposite of biblical faith. There is no direct opposite of biblical faith. And the reasons for this is simply everybody is given a measure of faith. Romans 12:3. God did not give everybody a measure of doubt. He gave them a measure of faith. Faith is a gift of the Spirit, 1 Corinthians 12:9. And faith also never passes away. We may doubt, but our doubts will most assuredly pass away. But faith will not pass away. But although there is no direct opposite of biblical faith, there are those things that are in opposition, those that are enemies of our faith. And as we've studied Mark, we've seen real-life examples of things that stand in opposition, at enmity with our faith. Simply unbelief. And this is more, if we study the Greek word of this unbelief word, it's not quite the same as unbelief as we think of unbelief. It takes our definition and adds even more to it. As unbelief is more than just not believing. It has implications of unfaithfulness. And it's likened to marital infidelity. That is in direct opposite of faith. That is what unbelief is. In Greek, there is not a word for unbelief. It is basically anti-faith or unfaith, or not having faith. We saw that familiarity, not just being familiar with, but having a sense of, I know this, or I know this person. as Nazareth had with Jesus. They grew up with him and they had become familiar. And this familiarity led them to apathy, that even when he would do miracles in Nazareth, they're like, who is this guy? Isn't this the son of Mary? Isn't this the handyman that lived down the street? Familiarity is an enemy of faith. When we hear a message, when we hear a pastor, and we think that we know that, we do not know it as much. It's an enemy to our faith and breeds apathy in the hearts of believers. Discouragement and fear, they destroy our perspective to see things as God sees them. They are an enemy of our faith. It hardens our hearts and it will limit our understanding. And now we've read about another enemy of our faith. Something else that is an enemy of our faith, and that is forgetfulness. Forgetting. Forgetfulness is an enemy of our faith. And as we studied faith and healing and miracles, we know that when we are living in enemies of faith, it limits miracles that God can do in our lives personally. It will limit the miracles of God that He will do in your life. Verse 11. The Pharisees came and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, why does this generation seek a sign? Truly, I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation. And he left them, got into the boat again, and went to the other side. Jesus had been doing miracles all over the place and giving signs. Why would he not give this group of people a sign? Why would he not do a miracle? He had the power to. We don't doubt that he absolutely could. And the answer to this question lies in James 4:6. But he gives more grace, therefore, it says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. He gives grace to the humble. If you studied who the Pharisees were, they were a group that during the intertestamental period sought to see that Israel never returned to idols. They saw the destruction that idolatry had brought into Israel. And they started very benevolently to see that Israel never returned to idolatry. They were well studied. They knew all the scriptures about the Messiah. But they did all the things of God without the Spirit of God. They left being a benevolent group and they became a group that lived a life that was ritual without relationship. They had repetition without revelation. They had religion without reality. This is what we call legalism. And it breeds pride. And they were asking Jesus in the pride of their heart for the sign. Pride is in opposition to our biblical faith. Verse 14. Now they had forgotten to bring bread, and they had only one loaf with them in the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes do you see, and having ears do you hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up?" They said to him, 12. "And 7 for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of broken pieces did you take up?" And they said to him, 7. And he said to them, "Do you not yet understand?" We do not see until now in this chapter the effects of the disciples' forgetfulness. Because Jesus did the miracle even though they came in forgetfulness to him. And how are we going to feed this? He did the miracle. And we do not see the ill effects of forgetfulness until now. We see the effects in verse 17 where he says, "Do you not yet perceive or understand?" Forgetting will make us see the natural and forget the supernatural. It will harden our hearts. Forgetting will limit our capacity to receive the things of God. In verse 18 he says, "Having eyes do you not see, and having ears do you not hear?" Forgetting will limit our perspective on things. And the miracles of God will be limited in our lives. And it's never because God can't do it. But just as Jesus refused miracles to the Pharisees, it's not because he can't. And as he didn't do miracles in Nazareth, it was not because he could not. But it was because God would not violate their free will. It would have gone against his divine institution, an institution that he had already set up. Man's free will. But also, just as in the disciples here, he limits miracles not only because of pride or familiarity, but also forgetfulness and lack of understanding, because our capacity is not there yet. He will hold back a miracle in our life till we have grown, till we've been strengthened, and our capacity is there, that he can bless us with this and it not overtake us. Verse 22. "And he came to Bethsaida, and some of the people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked, 'Do you see anything?' And he looked up and said, 'I see people, but they look like trees walking.' Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him home, saying, 'Do not even enter the village.'" So we've been studying Mark and this connection between faith and healing. Many teach so often the connection between the individual's faith and the healing there. But as we've been studying Mark, more oftentimes we've seen the faith of those around an individual playing a role. Just like these people that brought this blind man. They had the faith. They brought him in faith. Just like the people that let the man down from the roof that was a paraplegic. They had the faith. Nothing is said of the faith of the individual, but those around him. And this is because the church is here. The church is here for the sick and the sinners to be healed. Preaching is the mission of the church. This is our mission. And in preaching there is healing. Because healing is the mission of the church also. And it is strongly by the faith of those in the church that we bring individuals before God for their healing. And He is not limited to just the natural. But we by faith also believe in the supernatural healing of God. Verse 27, and Jesus went on with His disciples to the village of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way He asked His disciples, who do people say I am? And He told them. And they told Him, John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets. And He asked them, but who do you say I am? Peter answered Him, you are the Christ. And He strictly charged them to tell no one about Him. And He began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And He said this plainly. And Peter took Him aside and began to rebuke Him. But turning and seeing His disciples, He rebuked Peter and said, get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. And calling the crowd to Him with His disciples, He said to them, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what can a man give in return for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when He comes in the glory of His Father with His holy angels. When we look at situations, do we see them in the same manner, in the same way that God sees them? Do we have a heavenly perspective? Are we setting our minds on the things of God or on the things of man? When we look at the perspective of what's happened in this doozy of the last week, in the fall of a country, refugees trapped, and a pandemic surge, and a rise of inflation, likely hyperinflation. Do we not see that we've been here before? We've been through all of this before. There was the fall of Saigon. There was the Spanish flu, smallpox, polio. There was a Great Depression. And do we have God's perspective as of 1 Corinthians 10:13? No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. These things this last week, they are things that are common to man. War. The United States has been at war the entirety of Tyler's and Nathan's life. Is it not common to man? No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with temptation, He will also provide a way of escape that you may be able to endure it. And I'd like to ask you to turn to Luke 22:19. Luke 22:19. And He took bread, and when He had given thanks, He broke it and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Have you forgotten what God has done in the past? Have you forgotten the miracles that you have experienced? Have you forgotten to look to God when you're in the valley of dark times? Or you're on the mountaintop of the good times? I realize with the pandemic we haven't celebrated communion as a church in quite a while. And we do hope to very shortly start doing it for this reason. But it's fine. Because why do we celebrate communion? It's to not be as the disciples when there's 4,000 people to feed and be like, well, how are we going to feed them? We take communion to remember.